Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 8 of Series 6. The question this evening is, what are values? Are they objective, subjective, or just indications of absence? The reading for today is from my work The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 3. So our overall objective in these workshops is to grasp, to understand human existence as consciousness and to resolve its problems in terms of value. In the previous 6 workshops, we have defined consciousness and outlined various expressions of value. Today, we are looking at the presuppositional question of what is value or what are values. Now, the question, what are values, is often asked in academic philosophy as well as in serious conversation. And simply asking the question, of course, is a development of understanding as well as an indication of a lack of awareness of what is value. That is, values have always been a part of human life, but the idea of value has long been absent. For example, value is an essential element in religion, but religion typically has no concept or theory of value. To do so would plunge religion into raw mental states that would undermine religious reality. Similarly, Nietzsche was a philosopher of value who subtitled his work "Thus Spoke Zarathustra" with the words "for everyone and for no one." So I think of today's topic in a similar way. Values are ubiquitous in human life, but they are poorly understood. So these examples indicate a neglect of value that we first need to outline before defining value. But a brief definition of value is initially required so that we know what we are talking about. To begin with, we can give some examples of value like desire, wanting, love, hate, morals, aesthetics, and bias. Others may give objects as examples of value like money, excellence, truth, existence, and beauty. These examples illustrate a known problem of the diversity of values. That is, many different states or objects may be masquerading as one concept, that is, value. Another problem is that conventional ways of defining value may be just applications, not definitions of value. For example, ethical, economic, aesthetic, family, religious, and scientific values. Yet in this paper, I will present a viable concept of value with features of subjectivity, preference, and quality. And I want to explain value phenomenologically in terms of mental states, not with logical analysis. In the meantime, though, we can define value functionally and ostensively. Some functional and ostensive definitions of value can also indicate the significance of value at the same time. For example, in religion, God represents the believer's highest value. Love is a mode of value, with different kinds of love presenting different kinds of value. Politics was described by David Easton as the authoritative allocation of values. And economics is the quantification of material values in terms of monetary tokens. Yet both the history and the history of the neglect of the concept of value are vital to understanding what value is. Of course, the ancient Greeks had a word for value, axia, from which we have the word axiom. Plato discusses intrinsic and instrumental value, though his values were located in an eternal realm. And Aristotle coined the very word ethics. But in her work Modern Moral Philosophy, Elizabeth Anscombe tells us that the term moral just doesn't seem to fit in its modern sense into an account of Aristotelian ethics, because Anscombe explains that it lacks the concept of a moral sense of ought. Aristotelian ethics was also naturalistic, blind to the fact-value problem, and overlooked people as ends in themselves. And Aristotelian character and inclination neglected the Kantian goodwill and moral intent. Alistair MacIntyre elaborates on these points and informs us that in Latin, as in ancient Greek, there is no word correctly translated by our word moral. He goes on, Cicero invented moralis to translate the Greek word ethikos, meaning pertaining to character. And later, in 1776, Etienne Bonneau was the first economist not to agree with objective value or utility value theory. He considered that both value and utility have a psychological substrate and result from individual interest. Summing this up and bringing us up to the present, Charles Gray Shaw wrote, I quote, "Value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy. For example, Hume's discovery of the is-ought distinction came very late and is still often overlooked today. And in the 19th century, science was regarded as objective and value-free, and now it's seen as value-laden. Also in the 19th century, Auguste Comte advocated a positivist and value-free sociology as social physics. This view was followed by Rudolf Carnap and the logical positivism of the Vienna Circle. And on this view, value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. Yet this neglect of value can still be found in analytic philosophy, shown in its preference for cognitivist explanations. And this neglect increases the suspicion that something important has been overlooked. And what has been overlooked are principles and experiences in terms of value. Both the character and neglect of value are taken up in John Mackie's argument that there are no objective values. Objective here means the status of ontologically substantive objects, not normativity or universality. Mackie gives three main arguments to support his view that there are no objective values. 1. The direction of dependence is mistakenly reversed, making the desire depend upon the goodness rather than vice versa. 2. His argument from queerness is that objective values would have an untenable quasi-objective status. And 3. He points to the psychological propensity of the mind to spread itself on external objects, also noted by Freud and Hume. To explain Mackie's argument from queerness, objective values would be anomalous. This is because objective entities can't have the subjective properties that value must have. And they are disparate kind of things, like numbers can't have properties of colour. Further to this argument from queerness, Mackie writes that if there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. I agree, because values like wanting and liking cannot exist independently of a conscious being. Mackie's argument can be quite convincing, but it has been presented with some challenges. For example, John McDowell points to the dependence of aesthetic value on the cognition of external objects. And the phenomenon of revealed values might suggest that values exist prior to being revealed. And the existence of intrinsic values in the world would also challenge Mackie's argument. But the rejection of objective values also applies to intrinsic values. And I will soon argue that the only candidates for intrinsic values are subjective mental states and people. Yet many religious and philosophical thinkers appeal to objective values quite straightforwardly. Such include Iris Murdoch, Susan Wolfe, Robert Nozick and Ronald Dworkin. A subjectivist view of values is held by existentialists, postmodernists and many others, including Mackie and myself. Wittgenstein also puzzled why there would be moral disagreement if values were manifestly objective. And he further warned of being bewitched by language with words like objectivity and values. That is, having a word for something can lead us into a false belief that it exists or we understand it. And Plato's view of values, located in an eternal realm, poses another problem for the idea of objective values. That is, objective values imply the impossibility of an infinite number of objective values. This is because an infinite number of objective values would be needed for an infinite number of situations. But these considerations raise the earlier problem of diversity for both subjective and objective accounts of value. That is, there may be many different objects or states masquerading as one concept, namely value. Yet I can offer a possible classification of different values that may or may not be clarifying. Firstly, there are perspectival values of value-laden science, bias, and numerical and truth values of true or false. Now, the idea of perspectival values is widely used by philosophers such as Williams and Nagel. Secondly, there are motivational and moral values of ethical principles and reasons for action. And moral values are universally recognized as a particular kind of value. And thirdly, experiential or affective values are those like love, hate, desire, guilt, shame, disgust and pity. But affective values aren't usually described as affective values. Now, for the sake of comparison and contrast and agreement of neglect, we can outline Ray Jackendoff's account of value. Now, Jackendoff describes this account as the peculiar logic of value. Jackendoff cites three features of value. One, valence, that is magnitude or intensity. Two, different types or kinds of value. And three, subjectivity or objectivity, and he defines objectivity simply as shared or generic values. Jackendoff then gives us 8 types or kinds of values, These are affective, utility, resource, quality, prowess, esteem, normative, and personal normative or human value. My criticism of these is that they are mixed types, and some are only applications of value. For example, affective values are a kind of value, but utility and normative values are applications. One problem with all these different types of values is whether all these states, again, can be properly described as values. Perspectival values don't even seem to have subjective experiential content. Numerical and truth values seem to be values, analogously, better described in some other way. Yet I believe they can be unified with properties like subjectivity, preference, and quality, as I later show. And that value does exist as a general term, as a collective of different values. A similar argument can be made for consciousness that some also hold doesn't exist. One argument is that neither consciousness nor value exist because they are collections of disparate mental states. This is disingenuous because consciousness has a unity of personal identity through space and time. And both consciousness and value exist as collections of different mental states. We can't argue this here, but consciousness does have a unity around personal identity through space and time. And human consciousness is also a self-consciousness that can center itself with the statement I am. The collectivity of value also doesn't diminish its significance as a general term for different values. And standard philosophical criteria are also available to help us understand the general concept of value, such as: are values subjective or objective? Are they attributed, instrumental, or intrinsic? Are they affective or cognitive? Are values subject to degrees or not? And there are less common criteria, such as: must values always involve mental objects? Are values always motivational or not? Must values be reflective, or can there be pre-reflective values of the unconscious or of animals? Yet before outlining some of these criteria, we need to explain the meaning of the term value states. The notion of value states is needed to explain the idea of an independence or a sufficiency of value. I myself argue that a sufficiency of value is better than a dependence on supporting cognitive frameworks. But to define value states, we do value things, yet there is also a state that accompanies the act of valuing things. Yet the further notion of a value state is my own term for mental states that necessarily contain values. For example, love, hate, dignity, self-esteem, honour, duty, resentment, and wanting. That is, unlike belief or perception, these states cannot exist without a value component. And as another criteria of qualification, value states can be both positive and negative values. Yet only positive values are viable objectives for ethics, meaning, or purpose in life. That is, states like hate, resentment, and jealousy can be said to negate rather than affirm value. We can also define value states by contrasting them to cognitive states and affect states. Examples of cognitive states are thought, perception, reason, knowledge, belief, and doubt. Examples of affect states are pain, pleasure, happiness, affection, despair, and anger. Yet my ambition is to define value non-reductively in its own terms, not in terms of external properties. I have begun to do this above by describing value states and by arguing for the subjectivity of value. I now want to look at features like objectivity, intentionality, intrinsic value, and cognition. Mackie's argument is about the objectivity of values as ontologically substantive objects existing in the world. Yet there is another important meaning of objectivity of values as normative or universal. The normativity or universality of values invariably refers to moral values. Aesthetic values like I like jam aren't thought subject to normativity or universality. Yet normative or universal values are often thought to be ontologically objective as above. This is because normative or universal values may be thought to need to exist independently of the mind. And if moral values were objects in the world, it would be easier to apply them as normative values. But in my view, normative values can be obtained from structures and dynamics of consciousness and value, such as the will to value. And to define value further, we can also distinguish between the formal and the material content of moral values. The formal content of moral value is its guiding principle, such as love your neighbour or do no harm. The material content of moral value is found in its actual application in the world. Such are injunctions like do not kill or do not steal. The concept of intrinsic value is another way of characterizing value contrasted to attributed or instrumental value. Intrinsic value is often thought of as a way of establishing normative or universal values. But as many intrinsic values are trivial, this isn't a legitimate argument in those cases. We can nevertheless quickly define intrinsic and instrumental or attributed values. Instrumental values are attributed with value as a means towards some other end. Intrinsic values are valuable due to their own inherent qualities. Consider the different ways in which values are considered to be intrinsic. Now, money is accepted as tokens without intrinsic value. Valuables like gold are thought to have intrinsic value, but only in an economic context. But valuables are only valuable for what they can appropriate, like houses or cars. But physical objects are only valuable for the satisfactions they bring. So on this view, ultimately, only mental states and conscious beings can have intrinsic value. Conversely, truth, beauty, and knowledge are traditional candidates of intrinsic value. William Frank Kenner, for example, names a long list of intrinsic values, including life, virtue, and consciousness. But this is disputed by Mackie and other arguments outlined above. Pleasure and happiness are also classically held by John Stuart Mill and others to have intrinsic value. But I argue that, in addition to being deficient as human objectives, happiness isn't always valuable. For example, I may regard happiness as a weakening, a distraction, or whatever, and thereby not desire it. And because pleasure and happiness aren't always valuable, they can't be intrinsic values. Yet I should note here that my principle of sufficiency of value is inherently of intrinsic value. This is because sufficient values are values that are affirmed by a will to value. Now, G.E. Moore and Robert Nozick defined intrinsic values by their organic unity or internal coherence. But this is an externalist and objective definition that even Nozick himself wasn't entirely satisfied with. And these definitions lack both experiential content and internal or subjective features. Yet in this analysis, I am now moving closer to defining value with internal rather than external features. We can, however, even do that with the fact-value distinction, which purports to tell us what value is not. More telling, though, is the is-ought distinction that we haven't time to discuss here. Yet the fact-value distinction finds representation in the cognitive non-cognitive classification in analytic philosophy. I will say more about this relation with cognition shortly with the notion of intentionality. But the cognitive non-cognitive classification is biased in favour of cognition and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So in my view, we should replace the non-cognitive category with a more specific affect, will and value. This results in the classification of 4 types of mental state of cognition, affect, will and value. C.G. Shaw refers to cognition, emotional and volitional states, incorporating value into volitional states. We also earlier outlined 3 categories of perspectival, motivational and affective values. Together with cognition, affect, will and value as building blocks, these enable us to deconstruct value. Perspectival values are largely cognitive with minimal affect and will. Motivational values arguably require affect and will to enable action. And affective values aren't just feelings, but require cognitive preferences in order to be values. The will is also a fundamental aspect of mind that is differentiated into various functions of value. Wanting is a directional capacity of the will that implies value. Choice is a selective capacity of the will that also implies value. Loving and hating are positive and negative affective capacities of the will that imply value. And for other purposes, the will implies value and is thereby consistent with the will to value. But hypothetically, the will and value are different. That is, I may value something but not be motivated to acquire it unless I have the will to do so. The fact-value distinction, however, traditionally demarcates value by excluding it from cognitive states. But a more graduated view allows value to permeate into value-laden facts through entanglement. For example, logical positivism regarded values as meaningless because they have no cognitive content. But it is well argued that there are no pure states of value, and this results in variable or relative classifications. For example, the social scientist Tristan Engelhardt holds that knowledge is always value-laden. Anthony Grayling described the world as being saturated with values. And Hilary Putnam put it in terms of the breakdown of the fact-value dichotomy. The relation between value and cognition can also be understood with the concept of intentionality. Intentionality is a process of intent towards mental objects, but it is not the same as motivational intent. Husserl and Heidegger preferred to use the term directedness rather than intentionality. The idea is often expressed as aboutness, that consciousness is conscious of something. But others claim that states like pain and pleasure need not intend towards objects, and therefore they would not be intentional. Yet the concept of intentionality was introduced as such by Franz Brentano, who made it a mark of all mental states. And in both analytic philosophy and phenomenology, intentionality implies relations with cognitive objects. And some phenomenologists are especially interested in the quality of those relations. It is the quality of those intentional relations and the character of their objects that determines what particular values are. My question here is whether values must be intentional, involving mental objects, or to what degree must they be intentional. This question arises because I not only define values by their objects, but by their degree of independence from objects. This is another issue, yet it nevertheless adds to our understanding of what value is. And value is thereby explicable as a quality of intentionality influenced by its mental object. Yet in my view, the subjectivity of value is understood best in its relations with consciousness. In this respect, phenomenology makes close connections between consciousness and value. Sartre writes, for instance, that the being of the self is value, and he continues that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. What we are saying here is that value and consciousness are coexistent. This is explained with a close identification between consciousness, value, and choice as selection. Sartre writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. That is, elimination and selection presuppose preference, which is an expression of value. Yet Sartre writes, choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. And again, selection isn't just a deliberated choice, but selection as part of an underlying structure. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis tracing choice back to its ontological foundation. This is because his ultra-phenomenological method prevents him from employing psychological graduations. That is, from the unconscious, the preconscious, immediate consciousness to reflective consciousness. Yet we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness. And we can continue to say that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value. For example, When I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are the kind of selections that are essential also to epistemic contrasts and perceptions. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen, it needs a contrast. But at least two objections can be made to this kind of explanation of incipient values. One, they are not the values we need of motivation, morals, meaning or purpose. Two, values also emerge from social and biological sources without selection or choice. In response to the exception of biological values, such must be experienced in consciousness in order to be values. That is, an automatic propensity to action is not a value. Such are only latent or potential values. They only become values on selection as preferences of mental states. For example, animals express preferences in procreation, nourishment and survival behaviours. So animals are conscious creatures which can have values but not moral values. In response to requiring values of motivation, morals or meaning, the above is an account of incipient values. And such an account of the origins of value includes the potential for the development of more substantive values. But Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl offer such an account of time that provides more substantive values. Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and a flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through the diversity of space. And substantive values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. But this view is still a desire or needs-based theory of value which Sartre defines, and Sartre defines value as a lack or absence. Yet Sartre's account might simply be describing value in terms of what we do not have. It also accords with his attachment to the ideas of absence, possibility and freedom, as well as corresponding with Sartre's negative appraisal of consciousness. That is, in consciousness bringing nothingness into the world as a kind of fissure within being. But these views that Sartre gives us fail to account for the positive aspect of value lighting up our world with meaning and purpose. It fails to account for sufficiency of value, like magnanimity, moral fortitude, courage and love. It doesn't account for substantive value states, value satisfactions and value sufficiencies. The failure of Sartre's negative views of value and consciousness is evident in the consequences of his ontology. He sees conscious being for itself of mankind as a useless passion seeking the permanence of physicality. But this relation is both contingent and neglects a substantiality or a sufficiency of value. That is, there's an alternative response to consciousness seeking the permanence of physicality. That is, replace the permanence of physicality with a more appropriate sufficiency of value. Yet the definition and viability of a sufficiency of value is the subject of another workshop. Yet Sartre's two notions of value as choice or preference and as lack or absence offers leading interpretations. Sartre's notion of lack includes the idea that value can simultaneously be and not be, or exist and not exist. And these reflect an ambiguity and a tension thought to be characteristic of value. That is, value is seen as a process or movement from a lack or insufficiency to a sufficiency. In this way, values are sometimes regarded as actions or verbs rather than nouns. Robert Nozick similarly defines value as possibility. But again, this is an inadequate external definition. Yet the possibility is one of the preconditions of not only value but also of human consciousness. That is, possibility marks out the space that thought, passion and value can enter into. The notion of preference also helps to explain how value invariably has the property of quality. Values aren't just bleached out, neutral conceptions of things. They have qualities. And these qualities can be explained by infusions of affect and will, as well as cognition. But explaining the qualitative aspects of value can be compared to the very hard problem of affect in consciousness. The hard problem is, of course, Chalmers' term for the difficulty of explaining consciousness. Yet we can make comparisons with the qualia of consciousness, and Dennett expectedly, of course, denies both of them. Qualia are the feelings and experiences of the introspectively accessible, phenomenal aspects of our mental lives. There is disagreement about the status and relations of qualia, but it's difficult to deny that qualia exist. In this way, qualia can be said to help explain the experiential and qualitative aspects of value, and such are present in varying degrees depending on the type of value in question. Yet an answer to the question what is value should also include its scope and possibilities. For example, our view of science, reason or mathematics must go beyond our current understanding of them. That is, we believe and have faith that mathematics or whatever is a coherent system. In the same way, our view of value should include its significance in the widest context of explaining human life. That is, value isn't just a fundamental constituent of consciousness, or is a state that has properties needed to resolve primary problems of human life, but offers a principle extending from the origins of consciousness to future possibilities. In conclusion, however, we have defined value as an aspect of subjectivity and consciousness with notions of cognition, affect and will. Value was further defined with the notions of choice, selection, preference, contrast, tension and quality. And value wasn't just argued to be a subjective mental state, but a constitutive property of consciousness. This was endorsed in some way by Husserl, Heidegger and Sartre, with the idea that value is at the heart of consciousness. and that selection and preference lead to explanations of the experiential aspects of value. Finally, we have been discussing value because it's of significance in a value perspective. That is, value is proposed here as a principle of life, as the will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. But this perspective of value may have got ahead of itself, as well as ahead of other concerns. More common concerns were about psychological experiences rather than moral meaning or purpose. An interest in particular conceptions of things hugely eclipses their evaluative satisfaction. So next week we will look at some of the characteristics of value that make it a primary experience of life. So let me have your criticisms or comments on the Meetup website or during the meeting. Thank you.